And I'd like to say it's a great pleasure to be here in Manitoba, because for those of us in Europe, when we look around the world, where are the little beacons of hope, where there are governments that still have a commitment to social justice? Well, Manitoba is one of those that we see as one of those little beacons of hope. And I'm also very happy to be in Winnipeg, because I know just across the road you're building this Museum of Human Rights. I think this is a first. I can't think of any other city that's got a Museum of Human Rights. And I'm very interested to know as to exactly what's going to be in this museum, and whether it's... Perhaps this is something we can take up in the discussion. And in particular, whether it's going to treat human rights as a kind of living area of contestation that has the potential to advance social justice agendas. So what I'm going to talk about tonight, I'm going to share with you some collective work that I've been doing with a team in the USA and a team in Mexico, developing a framework and then applying it to the USA and Mexico to look at macroeconomic policy from a human rights perspective, with the idea that this might be a framework to help us hold governments to account for what they are and are not doing, and how far their economic policies are in compliance with the human rights obligations which they have. And as John says, a book is coming out next month, published by Z Press, where we bring all this work together. I've got one or two flyers for it. I'll put them on the table over there in case anybody's interested. But what I'm going to talk about tonight is drawing upon the two chapters in the book that deal with NAFTA. One chapter on the USA and NAFTA, another chapter on Mexico and NAFTA, because I thought we didn't include Canada in the book, and anyway, you all know a lot more about Canada than I do, but I hope in the discussion we can take up issues about how far the things that we've identified as cause for concern in the USA and Mexico have application to Canada. And also somebody came to me just at the beginning and said, was I going to be talking about this new trade agreement between Canada and Europe? I'm not. But in the discussion, I think we can, and we can discuss whether the issues that we've identified as cause for concern are similar issues in this trade agreement, which is under negotiation at the moment. So let me first, probably you here don't need much reminding of the key aspects of NAFTA that we focused on in this book. Before I just remind you of them, I should say the other areas of policy that we looked at in the book were public expenditure, taxation, monetary policy, and regulatory policy. And we wanted to look at trade policy, and that's a big area, so the most obvious thing to look at, given that we were looking at Mexico and the USA, is NAFTA. So, well, you all know it's a trade agreement between US, Mexico, and Canada, negotiated by in the 1990s by the administration of Bush Sr., and brought into force in the USA by the Clinton administration. It required all three nations to eliminate control on imports scheduled to be phased out immediately or over a 10 or 15-year period. It was in a context where more than one half of the trade value was already exempt from tariffs, but the last remaining trade restrictions were removed by the beginning of January 2008. Like many trade agreements these days, it wasn't just about trade, it included a number of side agreements, particularly side agreements relating to the rights of business and the rights of labour that had implications for the scope of domestic policy. in particular, the cross-border investment agreement, and I'll be referring later on to the issues of the provisions of Chapter 11, which deal with the rights of cross-border investors and put limits on environmental protection, service sector regulation, investment and development policy, and government procurement. So, like many trade agreements these days, it's far more than simply an agreement about reducing tariffs or phasing out quotas. So let me say a little bit about why did we want to look at NAFTA and these other areas of economic policy from a human rights perspective. Because of course there's been a lot of critiques of NAFTA from a social justice perspective. It's not that we're raising a completely new idea in raising issues about social justice in NAFTA, but we wanted to look at this through a human rights lens for several reasons. One is that the focus on the human rights perspective focuses on the relation between people and government in terms of dignity, rights and obligations. And we have particular focus in our work on obligations of governments. It draws attention to international and national legal processes around human rights through which governments may be held accountable. It draws attention to the appraisal of property rights, and it encourages us to use as the default standard human rights, not property rights, not specifically not the rights to buy and sell and make money. Whereas in the evaluative frameworks of conventional economics, neoclassical welfare economics, for instance, the default set of property rights to which, within the framework of which evaluations takes place, are essentially commercial property rights, rights to buy, sell and make money. And you take a particular distribution of rights as given, and then you argue about whether these policies are going to be the most efficient policies within the context of that specific set of rights. We have found what's valuable about human rights is it puts property rights in a much broader context and reminds us that there are a lot of other rights that have to be taken into account, and that the starting point ought to be human rights rather than there's a very narrow construction of property rights. And we should be asking the question not whether the policies lead to efficient allocation of resources given the distribution of these rights to buy, sell and make money, but rather we should be asking, do the economic policies help us with the realization of human rights, with the making real the human rights that are specified in treaties? It also draws our attention to non-utilitarian ethics and the limits to trade-offs. And again, this is a challenge to the framework of conventional neoclassical welfare economics, the framework that is used there to evaluate policy, which is a utilitarian framework. It's still greatest happiness of the greatest number. We have more sophisticated ways of thinking about it and calibrating it. And within then, you say there are all kinds of trade-offs that you have to take into account. It's not that we're denying there are sometimes trade-offs that you have to be worried about and you have to prioritize, but we feel that the human rights perspective is valuable for drawing attention to the fact that human rights must not be violated. So you can worry about the trade-offs once you've assured yourself that the policies that are being put into place are not going to be violating anyone's human rights. And finally, it's a framework which draws attention to processes of public reasoning, deliberative processes of public reasoning, like the one we're hopefully going to engage in tonight in our discussion, rather than simply using financial calculus. We're worried about the fact that so much discussion about economic policy is reduced to financial calculus, And that's seen as, there's answer, there's nothing further to discuss once you've produced a financial calculus that says this policy is the most efficient, or this policy is going to produce the greatest rate of growth. It's not that we think financial calculus has no role to play, but we think it should be one ingredient in a process and framework of public reasoning, where we're also going to recognize the limits to financial calculus and to bring into the discussion a range of other kinds of evidence and perspectives. So that was our motivations, and we were trying to create a conversation between two groups of people that we thought didn't talk to one another very much, and maybe the same in Canada, I don't know. A group of people who are human rights lawyers and human rights activists who are very concerned about economic, social and cultural rights, as well as civil and political rights, but particularly we were interested in the groups of human rights activists and lawyers who are very interested in economic and social rights on the one hand, and groups of progressive economists on the other who have a concern with social justice, with poverty and inequality. And for various reasons, Radhika Balakrishnan and myself found ourselves talking to both of these groups and finding they didn't talk to one another. And we thought it would be valuable to try and bring about some kind of dialogue. What can the human rights folks learn from the work of progressive, social justice-oriented economists? What can the economists learn from the human rights folk who are working on economic and social rights? And we identified that our way in was going to be obligations of government, although many human rights activists would start the other way around with different kinds of rights. We are going to bring in different kinds of rights, but because the focus is starting on government policy, we wanted to start as our way in on the obligations, to remind governments that they have obligations. And we found there was already quite elaboration of this in the human rights community among those who work on economic, social and cultural rights. They summarize the human rights obligations of governments in terms of the obligation to respect, which requires states to refrain from interfering with the existing enjoyment of economic, social and cultural rights, the obligation to protect, which requires states to prevent violation of such rights by third parties, and is particularly relevant therefore to the issue of regulation of the private sector, and the obligation to fulfill, which requires states to take appropriate legislative, administrative, budgetary, judicial and other measures towards the full realization of economic, social and cultural rights. So respect, protect, fulfill. NAFTA is, among other things, a form of legislation. There had to be pieces of the legislation had to be introduced into the national legislature of all three countries. Within these obligations, there also a distinction made between the obligation of conduct and the obligation of result. And the obligation of conduct is about what the actions that governments take. It requires action reasonably calculated to realize the enjoyment of particular rights. And the obligation of conduct is about, well, do we know anything about what the outcomes are? Do we know anything about our people's enjoyment of the rights improving? So it requires states to achieve specific targets to satisfy a detailed substantive standard. With respect to some states and some rights, they have elaborated quite detailed substantive standards against which you can measure the results in terms of improving the enjoyment of rights. In other cases, it might be more vague, like full employment. But nevertheless, that's the kind of, or improved nutrition. These are the kinds of things that are meant by result in this context. So we needed to get information both about the the dimensions of conduct and about the dimensions of results. Within that framework, then, states must pay particular regard to 6 key principles. And these 6 key principles particularly come from the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. The requirement for progressive realization over time using maximum available resources. This is a recognition that with economic, social and cultural rights, it's not easy to achieve them overnight, so it's progressive realization over time, but using maximum available resources. And I was talking with somebody before we started about the issue of taxation and where is the tax going, and tax revenue is part of this maximum available resources. How much is the government raising in revenue? Is it actually giving all kind of tax breaks to rich individuals and big corporations, which reduce the amount of tax revenue it's got available for realizing economic and social rights? And that's one of the issues we looked at when we looked at taxation. Next important principle is the avoidance of retrogression, i.e. of measures that reduce the enjoyment of human rights. And this is obviously particularly germane in times of crisis. In times of crisis, economic crisis, well, there's likely to be some retrogression in the enjoyment of human rights. But then the obligation is that the government shouldn't just accept that, it should try to introduce policies that counteract that, rather than deepen it. So that's an important principle to look at. Has the enjoyment of some human rights from the part of particularly of deprived groups, has it worsened as a result of the policy measure? Then minimum core obligation for the satisfaction of minimum essential levels, bit of a mouthful, but what it says is no matter what your economic situation is, no matter what resources you've got, you should be paying particular attention to your obligation to satisfy minimum essential levels of things like the right to food, the right to housing, the right to water, the right to an adequate standard of living. And so it's something that says we have to direct our attention first, or governments have to direct their attention first to the most deprived. And this is an immediate obligation, not something you can say we've got a 10-year program for doing, but it's something you should address immediately if there are substantial numbers of people in your country who are deprived of these basic rights. Then the issue of non-discrimination and equality, which is a substantive, not just formal. It doesn't mean, for instance, if it's discrimination against women or discrimination against different particular racial groups, it doesn't mean it means, of course, not having laws that overtly discriminate and practices that overtly discriminate, but it means much more than that. It means that public policy should aim to secure substantive equality between different social groups. And that again too is an immediate obligation, something you should immediately be moving on. This obviously speaks to the issue of inequality. And there is a view among lots of people, yes, but only inequality in terms of social inequality between men and women, between people of different ethnic groups, between those with disabilities and those who don't have disabilities. But it's more than that, and the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights has clarified in its General Comment number 20 on non-discrimination in economic, social and cultural rights that non-discrimination and equality also refers to economic status in terms of wealth and poverty. And we're going to be referring to that in the framework that we developed. And finally, the issues of process issues, participation, transparency and accountability. There should be scope for people affected by any policy to participate in discussion. The policy and the laws and rules and procedures it brings in should be transparent, and there should be some accountability mechanisms. So within that kind of framework, which we were applying to all of these areas of macroeconomic policy, when we looked at NAFTA, we decided to focus on three things in particular. We decided to focus on the implications for the right to work, including the right to just and favourable conditions at work. This is not just a right to any old job, it's a right to just and favourable conditions at work, as well as a right to work. The right to food, which again includes issues about, is the food nutritious? Is it healthy food? Not just how many calories are you getting? And then, if you like, a civil and political rights, in particular the right to take part in the conduct of public affairs, directly or through freely chosen representatives. A list there of the human rights instruments that were particularly relevant to our work, of course, beginning with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination against Women. And then, of course, we look to see what's the status of these treaties in the different countries. Mexico has ratified all of these treaties, as well as being a signatory to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And indeed, it has a constitution which has certain social rights enshrined in it. The USA is not, of course, as most of you will know, the only two of this list of treaties that the USA has ratified. And that is the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. Canada, of course, I think is a signatory to all of these. I mean, there the issues are, okay, your government is a signatory, but does it take any notice of it? And this is something we can take up in discussion, I think. You know, how can we use these processes more effectively? When let me now turn specifically to NAFTA and to look at the right to work, the rights at work. So first we were looking at the obligation of conduct. What kind of conduct associated with NAFTA? So we looked at whether the US and Mexican governments conducted any studies of the likely impact of NAFTA on employment of different social groups before concluding the agreement. We looked at whether they put in place adequate measures to compensate disadvantaged social groups that were likely to lose out if this proved to be the case. We looked at whether they ensured equal treatment of different social groups in the construction of the side agreements relating to labour rights and business rights, remembering that equality and non-discrimination applies to inequalities of wealth and poverty as well as all the other kinds of inequalities. Well, in the USA, there was a formal investigation, a formal study. What's the likely impact on the United States of having a free trade agreement with Mexico? And although it didn't offer any detailed estimates about job or income gains or losses, it did come to the conclusion that unskilled workers in the USA would be likely to suffer what it called a slight fall in their real income. And it came to the conclusion that skilled workers and owners of capital services, i.e. corporations, would benefit from the decline in the price of imports, and they would enjoy an increase in their real income. So this wasn't a very thoroughgoing study, but it did identify maybe there's some issue with unskilled workers, and unskilled workers are among the lowest income, most disadvantaged groups. In Mexico, they didn't make any official assessment, but there was an expectation that NAFTA would bring about more jobs in manufacturing, particularly export-oriented manufacturing in Mexico, and there was an expectation that small farmers would not be able to compete with large-scale farmers in the USA in maize-stroke corn production. I call it corn in the USA and maize in Mexico, but it's the same thing. Nevertheless, NAFTA involved the Mexican government, as part of its compliance with NAFTA, withdrew a lot of subsidies to small farmers and moved rapidly towards free trade in maize, and as a result lost a lot of revenue which might have been used for compensation for those affected. It lost a lot of tax revenue by moving more quickly to liberalise than NAFTA itself required. There were compensation measures in the USA, a very complicated set of compensation measures. There was already in place a trade adjustment assistance program. So there was a program that provided them with temporary aid and retraining. And so you think, okay, so far so good. Yeah, there are workers losing their jobs as a result of NAFTA, but it looks like the government has put in place some programs that will help these workers, will give them some kind of assistance, will help them to retrain for other jobs. But when you read the fine print, and we didn't do any new research ourselves, what we did is we looked at what was all the existing research about the adequacy of these compensation programs. The first thing was there was total underfunding of these programs. It had been estimated by the Bush senior administration itself that the NAFTA adjustment program would cost $4 billion a year from 1994 through to 2002. But in fact, the appropriations were well below this, both for the NAFTA adjustment assistance and the other trade-related adjustment programs. They were only given just over £3 billion for a whole 7-year period. So you can see there was, according to their own estimates, the government completely underfunded the program. And since 2004, the funding declined even further. Problem one. Problem two, many workers were unaware of the existence of this assistance. Problem number three, it was extremely complicated to actually get it if you did become aware of it. Only a fraction of the workers who were certified as eligible actually received the benefits to which they were entitled. And so, in final limitation, it only covered the manufacturing jobs, but there's a lot of evidence that suggests there were also NAFTA-related layoffs in service sector jobs that were linked in with the manufacturing sectors that had been adversely affected. So, is this really compliance with the obligations, we asked ourselves? Yes, in theory there's a compensation program. It doesn't actually seem to be doing very well in terms of compensating the workers who are displaced. A similar story in Mexico. There it wasn't manufacturing workers who needed compensation, it was small farmers who needed compensation. And they did bring in one program to provide an income transfer after NAFTA was introduced to small farmers producing basic crops, including maize. It was meant to last for 15 years, it was meant to be on a per hectare basis. But again, there's the same problem of lack of adequate funding. A program that had been providing a peasant farmer on average with $3.7 a month in 1995 was only providing $1.9 a month in 2006. So a similar kind of story of, in theory, there's some programs that are supposed to help small farmers adversely affected to adjust, maybe to move into some other activity that would be competitive, where they would be able to enjoy the right to work and get a decent living, but totally underfunded. Mexico returned to this in its fourth periodic report in 2005, and it claimed to have put in place regional development programs to address this. But our Mexican colleagues said, produced evidence really showing this didn't come to anything, and there was no effective regional program that was addressing the problems of the small farmers who'd been displaced by massive imports of maize from the USA. And there had been a North American Development Bank included as part of the NAFTA arrangements, and our Mexican colleagues felt this was a lost opportunity, that if this bank had been adequately funded on a large scale, like the Development Bank in Brazil, for instance, it could have perhaps put in the kind of investments in the rural areas that would have given those farmers more of a chance. But it didn't. There's a more detailed story, but it was a lost opportunity. It never actually fulfilled the promise of doing that. We also looked at the issue in terms of the conduct, in terms of the actual framing of the policy of the equal treatment of rights of different social groups. And NAFTA does have these side agreements, and it does have a labour side agreement, which has nice phrases about non-discrimination on grounds of gender and race and ethnicity and so forth. But we were particularly interested in how labour rights were treated compared to business rights, because the labour rights are more relevant to the poorer sections of the community and the business rights more relevant to the richer sections of the community. Well, many of you may be very familiar with this, that the side agreement on labour is much weaker than the side agreements which are germane to business rights. In particular, the intellectual property rights are very much strengthened by NAFTA. There are detailed standards for intellectual property rights, but there are no detailed standards for labour rights. And businesses can bring legal action in the country where they claim their intellectual property rights have been violated, but workers can't bring a comparable action on violation of labour rights in a particular country. Businesses can take cases to the NAFTA Free Trade Commission if they claim their rights are being violated. There is no such mechanism for workers. And trade sanctions can be imposed on one of the partner countries that's held not to be upholding intellectual property rights, but there's no comparable mechanism for a country which isn't upholding labour rights. So it's, I'm sure many of you very well, it's very asymmetrical, these side agreements, very asymmetrical treatment of labour and business. And although the Clinton administration made much in the USA of this side agreement on labour rights and how this was a first for this kind of trade agreement and a step forward, when you compare the content of that with the content of the way that the side agreements of various kinds strengthened the rights of business, then it's very asymmetric. So it didn't treat the rights of labour and business on an equal footing. Then we tried to look for some evidence on the obligation, relevant to the obligation of results. What were the outcomes? I mean, after all, we wouldn't be worried about compensation. Was the compensation adequate? If it actually turned out there was no adverse impact on the employment of low-income, unskilled workers. Again, we didn't do any new research ourselves. We looked to see what have progressive economists in the USA already, what have they already researched on the impact of NAFTA on employment in manufacturing in the USA. Well, I'm not given all the citations of the evidence here. They're all in the book chapters, which is another incentive to buy the book. But there's quite a lot of research that's been done on this, and probably in Canada too, I'll be interested to hear. But workers with high school degrees or less were particularly hit by job losses. Workers of Hispanic origin and other minority groups were displaced proportionately more than white and black workers. That was interesting. Hispanic workers and other minority groups, which is often, it could be of Asian ethnic origin, it could be indigenous people, were displaced proportionately more than white and black workers. On the gender side, in terms of job loss, men were disproportionately affected as compared to women in terms of losing their jobs. However, as well as job loss, it's important to look at re-employment, because again, if your loss of the right to work is temporary, it's not, and you easily get re-employment, then we're not going to have as much cause for concern as if your loss of the right to work is long-standing and you don't easily get re-employment. And there was a survey of this, the so-called dislocated worker survey, and that found that a very sizable minority, 1/3, did not find a new job within 1 to 3 years, so it's long-term unemployment for 1/3 of them. And then for the 2/3 who did succeed in finding a job within 1 to 3 years, half of them, the re-employment was a loss of earnings. So there was a retrogression, if you like, in their terms and conditions of work. There was an interesting study done by a friend of mine, Lourdes Benarilla, in New York State, and 2 factories that were relocated from upstate New York to Mexico as a result of the NAFTA provisions. And there they found that the male workers who lost their jobs were more successful in finding new jobs than women. Although actually more women had received these training benefits under the trade adjustment compensatory schemes, it didn't actually help them enough in terms of finding a new job. And they were being channeled in, the training they got was to channel them into a sort of narrow range of stereotypically women's jobs. And in terms of race, they found that workers of colour, this kind of umbrella term that they use in the United States to cover the non-white population, that workers of colour were less likely to be easily re-employed than white workers. And again, if they got a new job, it's more likely to be at a lower wage and lower benefits. So in the USA, we did find actually it's quite a wealth of information and studies on what were the NAFTA-related impacts on employment in the manufacturing sector. And it comes out really with a picture for many workers of retrogression. They either don't get a new job, they're long-term unemployed, or if they get a new job, it's at worse terms and conditions than the jobs they had before, with Hispanic workers particularly hard hit in some dimensions, workers of colour hard hit more than white workers, and for men and women the picture a little bit different, as whether you're thinking about losing jobs or whether you're thinking about re-employment. And we found there wasn't quite such a wealth of relevant information in Mexico because the studies there hadn't always pinpointed those sectors that are particularly related to NAFTA. But indeed there was a rapid increase in export manufacturing jobs following NAFTA, but it wasn't sustained. I mean, it wasn't sustained not because of anything intrinsic to NAFTA, it wasn't sustained because of competition from China. So you can't lay that at the door of NAFTA, the fact that it wasn't sustained, except that you can say, well, maybe this strategy in Mexico of trying to improve manufacturing jobs through an export-oriented strategy turned out to actually be rather risky and not sustainable once China is coming into the picture. And the Walmart factor, Walmart is importing all its goods to sell in the USA from China, not from Mexico. So Mexico is losing out in jobs. Even in the period where manufacturing employment was increasing, the real wage was falling. So again, a deterioration in rights at work. If we look at the maquila factories that are directly related to NAFTA and to the export of goods to the USA in particular, the gender wage gap grew in the maquila factories. And also regional disparities grew in the maquila factories, with higher wages in the better off northern border states than in the southern areas of the country. After NAFTA, maquila factories weren't just in the border areas, they were in many, many parts of Mexico. And as had been expected, there were very adverse impact on agriculture. 2 million jobs were lost in small-scale agriculture, and migration from Mexico to the USA increased. Although one of the arguments that have been put forward for introducing NAFTA is we won't have migrants, we'll have exports of goods. In fact, that wasn't the case because there was a lot of migration now from the small farming communities that had been hard hit. So migration from Mexico to the USA increased, both documented and undocumented. There's of course a whole set of issues then which, well, I'm not going to go into, we didn't look at in any detail, but about the rights of undocumented migrant workers in the USA and the enormous attack they are under, and the increasing attack they are under now as various states in the USA try to deprive, say, the children of undocumented migrants of the right to education. So the whole set of issues there about the way in which the undocumented migrants coming from Mexico to the USA are being deprived of basic human rights. So having looked at this range of evidence from Mexico and the USA, we felt there was evidence that both governments had failed to meet the obligation with respect to the right to work, and indeed rights to just and favourable conditions of work, because groups that were already relatively deprived in terms of the enjoyment of the right to work, of rights at work, and of economic and social rights more broadly, had been hit hard in both countries by NAFTA, and the compensation measures were inadequate, and labour rights were weakened, and well-off groups, particularly owners of large corporations, benefited. And so you think, well, if workers on both sides of the border are losing out, who's gaining? And the argument that a lot of progressive economists put forward in the USA is who's gaining is the big corporations. Example here about a big poultry producer. Tyson's the world's largest poultry producer, probably producing them under terrible conditions as far as animals' rights are concerned as well. But first of all, NAFTA allowed it to displace producers of small farmers producing poultry in Mexico, because they could import it much more cheaply from the USA now, and it increased its market share. And there was an example about this guy Pedro. He'd got this small poultry business, he was put out of work, and then he goes as an undocumented worker to the USA to work for Tyson's, the poultry giant, and again, of course, the attack on the wages and benefits and so forth there. So that workers on both sides of the border, migrants and native, documented and undocumented, their rights and their enjoyment of economic and social rights is retrogressed, while the property rights of big agribusinesses like Tyson has been strengthened. How am I doing for time? I just say a little bit about the issue of the right to food. We were interested in looking at the right to food, but this was harder to research. There was far less kind of detailed investigation of this, we found, than the issue of the right to work. And we didn't have the resources to do any new investigations ourselves. But just to remind you about the right to food, as clarified by the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to food, it's about regular, permanent and unrestricted access, either directly by producing it yourself or via buying it, quantitatively but also qualitatively adequate food, food that's consistent with the cultural traditions of the people who are it's being supplied to, and that ensures the physical and mental health of people. So governments do have an obligation to ensure that no one is deprived of minimum essential levels of food, and an obligation to progressively realise over time the right to food. And in looking at the right to food, we thought this was also an opportunity to look at the issue of extraterritorial obligations. This is the idea that a government doesn't just have human rights obligations towards the people living in its territory. It also has human rights obligations towards people living in other countries, insofar as the policies of government A affect adversely, possibly even positively, anyway, affect people in country B. There's what's known in the business as an extraterritorial obligation. We thought this was an interesting opportunity to look at this and to focus on the right to food in Mexico, because there was a lot of concern that this had been particularly affected by NAFTA, far more than the other way around. I mean, there are many issues about the right to food in the USA, and many cause for concern that the US government is not meeting its obligations, but not so directly linked to NAFTA. Whereas in Mexico, evidence is directly linked to NAFTA, because NAFTA facilitated the changing of the whole Mexican food system, if you like, towards American one, towards processed food, junk food, more meat, fast food, Walmart supplying food. So we wanted to have a look at that. So the obligations of conduct. Well, interesting thing here that we found in terms of what are the provisions of NAFTA with respect to maize. Again, it may be well known to many of you. Although the trade restrictions in terms of import duties were to be phased out over this 15-year period, subsidies from the US government to US corn producers were permitted to continue. Because of the way they organized, they managed to organize their system of subsidies in a way that was deemed not to be in contravention to NAFTA. So they had managed, whereas Mexican government is reducing subsidies to corn production, the US government is maintaining its subsidies to agribusiness, corn agribusiness. The US agribusiness was also permitted by the side agreements of NAFTA, the investment side agreements, to buy land in Mexico. Mexican constitution had to be changed to allow this to happen, and to set up food production and food processing plants in Mexico. And many US corporations bought corn processing or tortilla making factories in Mexico. And again, the investment side agreement allowed Walmart and similar companies to set up a shop in Mexico and to import, that style of delivering food into Mexico. So, results in Mexico. Well, first of all, I think perhaps slightly to the astonishment of economists who predicted NAFTA would be good for the right to food in Mexico, because it was bound to reduce the price of maize and maize-related products because American farmers were so much more efficient. That's not what happened. In fact, the price of tortillas, bread, and cereals rose. Tortillas in particular rose very, very sharply. Being made now by American corporations using maize imported from the USA. And the more healthy foods like tortilla bread and cereals and fruit and vegetables, their prices rose sharply and higher than the general rate of price increase. Whereas the price of meat and various kinds of processed foods fell considerably relative to the general level of prices. Mexican consumers are benefiting, aren't they, from the fall in the price of some kinds of food. But the question is it leading to a more healthy diet? So the worry there is, that the poorest households are having to spend more of their income on food now that the prices have gone up, from 73% of their income in 2000 to 79% of their income in 2006. And the diet of Mexicans has worsened. There's more fats, there's more refined carbohydrates, and the kinds of diseases associated with that kind of diet are on the increase. So Mexico is now the second most obese country in the world after the USA in terms of rates of obesity, and the incidence of diseases like diabetes has soared. We could also have linked that to the right to health, but we were focusing particularly on the right to a kind of nutritious food that gives you a good quality diet. So we think there's cause for concern there, that there's evidence to suggest that the US government has not complied with its extraterritorial obligation, the right to food in Mexico, and that the Mexican government itself has not complied with its obligation, the right to food in Mexico. NAFTA provisions have directly compromised the enjoyment of the right to food in Mexico by the way they have transformed the whole of the food system. The final point I was going to raise, but I can see time is running on, so I'll just mention it very briefly, are the issues of transparency, accountability, and participation. And in here we were particularly interested in the way in which the disputes, the system for identifying and settling disputes under NAFTA was set up. We took this as a particular example. As many of you will be aware, NAFTA, I think it was one of the first of the agreements to do this, although many agreements do this now, has a dispute settlement mechanism which allows any company incorporated in any one of the 3 partner countries to bring cases that challenge the laws and policies determined by the democratically elected governments of any of those 3 countries. This was the first. I think the WTO dispute settlement mechanism does not allow this. It's a settlement, it's a dispute between governments. The NAFTA one allows for a company to sue a government under the provisions of NAFTA. And these disputes are can be heard in 2 international arbitration bodies, the International Centre for the Settlement of Investment Disputes, which operates under the auspices of the World Bank, and the United Nations Commission on International Trade Law. For a long time, these procedures have been very opaque, very untransparent, very lacking in participation, and very hard for ordinary citizens who think they're affected by this to find out what's going on and to have any kind of, even to be allowed to go in the room, even to know what the outcomes were. There's been a lot of pressure on that, and apparently there have been some improvements now compared with what it was when it was first set up, but it's still a rather untransparent and difficult to participate in process, and there have been a lot of cases. So if you look at the results, again, we wouldn't be so concerned if there hadn't been very many cases brought under this dispute settlement mechanism. But in each NAFTA country, and that includes Canada, they have been sued in 16 or more cases by a corporation, and a variety of legislation and policies have been challenged So one example was a US waste management company challenged the decision by a Mexican local government to deny them a permit to operate a hazardous waste landfill. And they challenged the policy of the state government to create an ecological preserve in the area. And they said this had deprived them of profits and they should have compensation. And the NAFTA tribunal ruled that yes, the Mexican local government had violated NAFTA provisions, and it ordered the Mexican government to pay $16.7 million in compensation. There are other cases like that. I'm not going to go into them all, but there have been some, and many of you may know of them, involving US corporations and Canadian government, and the environmental issue seems to be one in particular. And these cases, both the procedure itself, which is corporations suing governments, at least the governments have been elected, even if we don't always agree with what they're doing, but citizens have some opportunity to participate, to hold governments to account. For the corporations, there isn't any similar kind of mechanism. So, all in all, we felt that there was evidence to suggest that the US and Mexican governments negotiated and operated a trade agreement in ways that do not fully comply with their human rights obligations. We particularly looked at the right to work, the right to food, and the right to participate in public affairs and hold governments to account and have transparency and accountability. So one question I have for all of you, is this the same in Canada? Do you think there's kind of similar issues and evidence? And then the other one, if there's going to be any kind of revision to NAFTA, sometimes we hear, there's going to be NAFTA's going to be revised, or is there any way we can mobilize in order to make sure some of these issues are addressed in any revision? And I guess the third one is, well, no, so NAFTA's water under the bridge now, sorry, we can't do anything about it, but any new trade agreements that these three governments are involved in, and I gather for you there's this one on the table with the European Union. What are the kinds of issues that you might want to bring to bear there? After all, Canada and the European Union go around the world telling all the countries to which they give development cooperation how they must comply with their human rights obligations. So I think sometimes we need to remind them human rights begins at home, and there's some complying with human rights obligations to be done in Canada, USA, Europe, as well as in countries to which they provide development cooperation. Let me finish there.
I wonder if you hadn't let your fellow economists off the hook. Because so much of what you said revolved around the fact that people predicted that things would happen as a result of this agreement that did not happen. And economic theory predicts that if you do this, prices will go down. They didn't. They went up. It predicts that if you allow free trade and free movement of factors, that the general condition of humanity will increase, Pareto optimality. This didn't happen. Now, one of the curious things about economists is it's about the only profession I know that has no social responsibility. And what I mean that, if you're a doctor, you take an oath, a Hippocratic oath, and you undertake to first do no harm. Now imagine if an economist had to take an oath saying first do no harm. Right? If you're an accountant, you're subject to regulation. If you're an architect, I think if you drive a truck, you at least have to pass a test, right?
Yes, I don't want to let the mainstream profession off the hook, but yes, I do want the human rights community to know more about the kind of resources that they could draw upon, which the critical economists are producing.